In this video, I'm going to talk about Mitori Geiko, the term in Kendo and Iaido for observing practice. When you say Mitori Geiko, it sometimes evokes a kind of disappointed look you get when you tell kids to eat their veggies. That's understandable. If you're observing practice, it usually means you're sidelined by an injury or you forgot some key piece of equipment. But sitting on the sidelines isn't the only time you can do Mitori Geiko, and it's actually an essential learning tool. The act of watching can have some profound effects on the brain, as some recent science has shown. And by the way, the term is Mitori, not Midori, as it's occasionally mispronounced. Midori means green, or the name of a certain violinist. One of the staple themes of martial arts stories, both old and new, is the main character being forced to endure an arduous apprenticeship, often doing menial tasks before the master even deigns to teach the apprentice any techniques. Then comes the pivotal scene where the protagonist happens to catch the master performing a secret technique. It's only really in modern times that teachers have been so open about showing their techniques in public venues. In the old days, many schools were quite possessive and secretive about their techniques. In the Far East, the classic version of how to steal a secret technique is by poking a hole through the paper in a screen door, and then the apprentice learns by imitating. This act of stealing a technique is a tried and true storytelling convention, and if you hadn't realized it before, now you'll start seeing it everywhere in martial arts movies. The reason this archetype is so prevalent is probably because there's a kernel of truth in it that applies to real-life training. When you're in the middle of Keiko, you're often blind to things that are going on with your own body. But when you're on the sidelines, you can see things in other people that they can't see. Sometimes we get wrapped up in our own head, and we forget to look around and realize we have this valuable resource around us. Learning in the dojo can happen at any time, not just when the sensei is explicitly teaching you something. That's why having accomplished practitioners in your dojo is a blessing. They serve as a concrete visual model that you can emulate. In martial arts, you shouldn't expect to be taught every detail of every waza. This kind of passive learning has inherent limitations. Many movements in sports and martial arts are much too complex to be broken down into a series of verbal instructions. Instead, a huge part of learning is done through observation and imitation, and experimenting with the technique to try to make it your own. In many ways, it may be better to do Mitori Geiko as part of your regular practice rather than when you're sitting on the sidelines. That's because you can try out what you've seen almost immediately rather than waiting for the next practice, by which time you may have forgotten all about it. One of the best times to do Mitori Geiko in Kendo is when you're standing in line to do Chigeiko. Try to focus on the Keiko happening in front of you and don't get chatty with the people standing in line. In Iaido, a great time to do Mitori Geiko is whenever your sensei or senpai performs a kata. It doesn't have to be a formal demonstration. Even if you see something out of the corner of your eye, if it's something that you admire, try to copy it and make it yours. There's some very intriguing research about how the act of watching can have profound effects on the brain. It involves something called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons were first discovered in the early 1990s when a team of Italian researchers found individual neurons in the brains of macaque monkeys that fired both when the monkeys grabbed an object and also when the monkeys watched another primate grab the same object. That means you don't have to perform that action to fire that neuron. The mere act of watching someone else perform that action fires that same neuron. It's a pretty radical discovery, and it has huge implications for how we learn complex movements. So what does this all mean for how to do Mitori Geiko? When you're doing Mitori Geiko and you see a flaw in somebody's technique, your first response should not be to critique it. It should be to ask yourself, am I doing that? Conversely, if you see something that you like, it shouldn't end with admiration. You should try to emulate it. In other words, you should try to steal the waza. When you start trying to emulate a person's movements, you'll find that some people are easier to copy than others. That's why it's a big advantage to have many different people to pick and choose from in terms of trying to copy them. You never really know whose style is going to click with your own movement patterns until you try to copy it. The Kendo or Iaido style that you admire most won't necessarily be the most useful to you as a visual model. We're all wired slightly differently, so you should be open to the possibility that somebody with a slightly different style could be better for you to copy. Also, one single person isn't necessarily the best person to copy for everything. For example, one person could be a good model for menuchi, while another could be a good model for footwork, and so on. Incidentally, a quick word about trying to change movement patterns while looking in the mirror. If you happen to have mirrors in your dojo, don't rely on them too much. Mirrors can be useful for some things, in particular fixing static positions. But when you're trying to fix a dynamic movement pattern, you have to rely on proprioception. That's the ability to know where your body is in space and in relation to other parts of your body. Proprioception is what allows you to touch your nose with your fingertips, even with your eyes closed. When you look in a mirror, you're actually not relying on proprioception because you're getting constant visual feedback about your body. So you think you're correcting your movement, but as soon as you take away the mirror, you're back to square one. The traditional way to fix movement patterns is to get feedback from your sensei or senpai. But if you want to check yourself, you should do it through video rather than using a mirror. Every smartphone nowadays has good video quality, so this is quite doable nowadays. Coaches in many different sports have known for quite some time that visualization can improve performance. But for it to be effective, the visualization has to be very specific. In other words, it doesn't help to vaguely think about doing Kendo or Iaido. Rather, you have to be very precise about visualizing the details. For example, the hand angle being this way or the foot moving that way. Studies have shown that visualization is the next best thing to actually doing the movement in terms of refining skills, as long as you're precise about it. I'll sometimes do visualization on the subway, and I find it quite useful. By watching carefully, especially when you're standing in line to do Jigeiko, and then trying to imitate it, this can become a very powerful tool in your own training. And remember, if you steal the right waza with Mitori Geiko, you too can vanquish the bad guy and win the day.